Episode number 1 is about the Meganoids, who are cyborgs from Mars, kidnapping contestants from a beauty pageant to forcibly transform them into other Meganoids. Their efforts are complicated by Reika and Tsuchida, two agents from Interpol, Beauty Tachibana, a contestant who's actually a mole scouting out the Meganoids' operation, and finally, the famous Haran Banjo, the dashing and debonair hero whose own personal strength and armaments just happen to match that of any number of Meganoid soldiers. The Meganoids' commander manages to keep hold of his hostages, including Beauty, and to momentarily evade Reika and Banjo, who have opportunistically teamed up. However, these two take chase in Banjo's patrol car, which has any number of useful gadgets and also turns into a jet. When they follow the Meganoids and their captives to Precarious Island Lair, their commander transforms into a Megaborg, a giant cyborg warform. But Banjo can keep up, because besides his personal strength, exhaustive armory, and transforming police car fighter jet, he also has the invincible steel man Daitarn 3, a massive machine that can transform from between vaguely a jet's shape, vaguely a tank shape, and very definitely a giant robot, each of which can engage the Megaborg on equal footing. That's the pun in its name, by the way. Dai as in the Japanese word for large, Tarn as in the English word turn. It turns from one form into another. There's 3 forms total, and it's big. Hence, Daitarn 3. Banjo and his Daitarn 3 beat the baddie and rescue the beauty contestants, all of whom escape on jetpacks. As they all go back to the mainland, Sanjo, Reika, and Beauty Tachibana decide to jointly become Banjo's girlfriends. Oh, and Tsuchida, the other guy who was around for a minute, he got shot. R.I.P. to him. I didn't go too fast, did I? Everyone catch all that? A lot of other robot shows from this period, frankly a lot of episodic cartoons even now, tend to have rather measured pacing. That is not the case with this show. Daitarn 3 rockets through its 25 minutes, and even its most languid of episodes will feature some type of excitement pretty regularly throughout. Many robot shows exhaust their first episode just establishing their setting. Daitarn 3 just moves. It's the late 70s. Megaborg cyborgs are kidnapping and transforming humans. Banjo is fighting against them. Beauty pageants are now battlefields. Super robot cartoons were a big commodity in early 70s Japan, but by the end of the decade, the boom seemed to be over. From 1972 to 1975, Toei and Dynamic Productions had dominated the genre, with the only outside production being Sunrise's Yusha Raiden. When Toei and Dynamic Productions had their falling out, the field was left wide open and a host of new studios got in on the hustle. 1976 and 1977 would see Tatsunoko, Aiken, NAC, Nippon Animation, and Wako all produce robot cartoons that crowded the airwaves, some of which were well regarded and some of which were not. And of course, Toei and Sunrise continued producing their own. By 78, the bubble seemed to have popped. Oversaturation led many shows to be middling successes, discouraging further productions. The only animated shows featuring super robots that year were Sunrise's Invincible Steelman Daitarn 3, Sunrise's General Daimos, and the single cartoon not produced by Sunrise, Toei Productions' Space Demon Daikengo. Let me take a second to mention the 2 shows this video is not about. Daikengo is a fun curiosity. It was the only show produced by the short-lived Toei, which was formed by a handful of artists who broke away from Tatsunoko. It was made on the cheap and aired on mostly non-affiliate stations, which meant it was likely doomed from the start even without super robot shows waning in popularity. Sunrise's work on General Daimos, on the other hand, resulted in some of the most vivid and well-animated television animation of the 70s, and certainly so within the bounds of super robot cartoons. Daimos was the 3rd robot show fully directed by luminary Tadao Nagahama and is frequently regarded as the best of that set. Not necessarily everyone's favorite. The earlier Combattler and Voltus have their diehards, and with good reason, but Daimos is more polished as a work of craft. Despite this, Sunrise was also in a tenuous position. To quote scriptwriter Yoshitake Suzuki, Sunrise was a small production company that would blow away in a stiff breeze. But he also said if a robot show became a hit, there was a high probability it would make a good profit. Being able to secure success within the risky super robot cartoon niche in the manner they did was critical to Sunrise's early survival. While the larger half of Sunrise's attention, crew, and money went into Daimos and a handful of contract work they were doing at the time, including for Academy Productions' space battleship Yamato 2, The team behind last year's profitable, if somewhat doleful, Zambot 3 began work on producing another Super Robot show for the Clover Toy Company. This was Daitarn 3, and it was a work with some very limited animation that, quite visibly, made use of a lot of tricks to make the most it could out of what must have been a fairly small budget. At this point, just having a super robot wasn't enough to sell a show, or more importantly, to sell a toy. Remember, we went from 7 studios producing 13 shows to just 2 studios producing 3 over the course of 2 years. This was partly because the basic draw of big, cool, piloted robot had been exhausted. You needed more than that now. 77's Dan Gardes was maybe the first to catch on, being super robots plus sports anime, in structure at least. General Daimos would be super robots plus romance anime, and even the ill-fated Daikengo was super robots plus Janbara. Daitarn 3 was Super Robots plus James Bond plus Charlie's Angels plus the yet-to-even-be-released in Japan Star Wars plus, well, basically any work of Western pop culture, pulp science fiction, or Americana has decent odds of being a source of influence, or at least contributing a throwaway reference. Daitarn 3 was a hodgepodge of everything its nerd animators found cool, any of which might be used or discarded as deemed useful for whatever current episode. This, alongside its particular animation, made the show kind of a mess. It also made it stylish as all hell. Daitarn 3 is an easy work to overlook, at least as a Western fan. It's not quite as conspicuous as Combattler V or the other Nagahama robots. It's not as infamous as Zambot 3 with its downer ending, and it sure as hell isn't Mobile Suit Gundam. It's easy to dismiss it as just that show with that robot that tends to show up in so many Super Robot Wars games. So, let's take a moment and take a look. Well, we already saw episode 1. Let's take a look at episode 2. Here's how it opens. A cityscape made from simple shapes and rough straight lines. A crowd shot of detailed faces atop abstracted bodies. The wide shot shows them as just swaths of color. You can see the texture of the pen marks. Meganoid Commander Neros, this episode's villain, orders the city's human population to evacuate so he can levitate and take off with the city. He's stealing the entire city. But let's not get too hung up on the plot details. More of the city is sharp lines. Some incredibly well-animated car crashes, but with some very abstracted and simply drawn cars. The city itself is shown being levitated, and it's all squares and blocks, and with the exception of the sky and the dirt, it's all flat colors with simple shading. It's very simple, very limited animation, and that is the term you tend to hear. This is limited animation. But it looks stylish. It communicates the action very well. Of course, the famous Haran Banjo learns of this theft. The establishing shot of his mansion has a little bit more detail. This is clearly an image the show plans to use more than once. But even so, this view has a lot of flat colors. Banjo's butler, Garrison, fills him in on the situation. Banjo heads out on his transforming police car or fighter jet. Notice how its transformation looks. It's a similar approach to animation. Banjo approaches the flying city and is assaulted by Meganoid forces. Check out how sketchy those artillery pieces are. You get that look when you Xerox pencil marks directly onto animation cells. Banjo is forced to come in low, which prevents him from getting a good view. He parks his jet car and takes an elevator up to the top of a skyscraper to take in the lay of the land, and we get the highlight of any robot cartoon, a display panel. I'm only halfway joking. The very geometric look of everything that's come before generally does lend itself well to information displays, regardless of if they're for a spaceship or an elevator. The same angular geometric look also applies to these hallways and the apartment. And now we're introduced to Toppo. Toppo is the show's resident little boy that hangs around that so many of these shows seem to require it to have. I'm being literal. The Japanese Wikipedia page directly states the planning department strongly requested such a character. More importantly though, look at this framing. What an absolute flex. I don't really want to talk too much about this one episode in particular, it just happens to be an excellent showcase of the show's visual style. Other things that happen: Banjo summons his flying attaché case that holds his machine gun. Banjo and Nero's fight, with the Daitarn 3's robot face being quite expressive. Daitarn 3 is punched through a building and are shown a split second of the interior of that building. Daitarn 3 punches Neros and American comic book style onomatopoeias displayed. We see the same a few minutes later when Daitarn 3 goes all kung pao on poor Neros. Daitarn 3's approach to style is abstracted and exaggerated, a heavy focus on framing and camera position, and features simple shapes with a lot of movement. It's animation with maybe more of a drafter's eye than a painter's eye. It's all limited animation, and it looks fucking fantastic. I can imagine some viewers asking, okay, you're telling me that some kids' anime from 70s Japan used limited animation. Big deal. What's surprising about that? And here's what's surprising. This is not what other robot shows from Sunrise looked like. The shows directed by Tadao Nagahama heavily shied away from such heavy abstraction, simplicity, and exaggeration. In fact, there was a focus on... realism isn't quite the right word, but there was a certain deliberate stiffness to how the people and machines in Combattler V, Voltus 5, and General Daimos moved. There's very little stretch and squish. There's also a lot of detailed painted backdrops and a lot of detail in the individual characters. Exceptions were with comedy characters and skits, such as with the family of yokels introduced in the back half of Combattler V or Araiso in his junkyard game from Yusha Raiden. And this style of animation wasn't out of sorts with Tatsunoko's contemporaneous Yadomon Kids show, or even the more adult-oriented Lupin III. Daitarn 3 is a super robot show that's animated like a comedy. This isn't totally without precedent. Zanbat 3, the show much of Daitarn's crew worked on prior, had a similar style sometimes on certain episodes. Episode 10 in particular not only has several of the same stylistic elements, but also features its hero robots similarly expressing facial expressions. Here's the part of the essay where I mention Yoshinori Kaneda, a star animator and a person of immense impact on Japan's animation industry. Several, not all but several, of the Sakuga in the show are either explicitly known to have been his handiwork or else display his sensibility. He's the impetus behind the robot having facial expressions. Kaneda had worked on other super robot shows before, notably Getter Robo and Gaiking, but for my money, Daitarn 3 is the first robot show where his style comes into true prominence. Hey, this is Z. I'm putting this bit in post. I just wanted to clarify that I mean Kaneda's style for robot cartoons in particular. Kaneda had a hugely identifiable style before this, but this particular comic form of animation in robot shows that he brings to the forefront in Daitarn 3 wasn't quite as much of a thing before now. Getter Robo had some great moments and Zanbat 3 had the occasional smartly animated episode. Daitarn 3 just looks like this. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the music as well. Like the preceding Zanbat 3, the soundtrack is by Watanabe Takio and Yuji Matsuyama. And like the preceding Zanbat 3, it's very jazzy, a little disco, and sounds a whole lot like Mobile Suit Gundam. There's sort of what I would describe as an electric whale song noise in the finale of the opening song, which is just the most I can't believe it's not Gundam sound in the world. But besides just sounding like Gundam, it's a remarkable soundtrack that perfectly complements the visuals. Well, I've discussed the show's basic concept, a bit about its pacing, a bit about its animation, and roughly the first 2 episodes. I suppose I should actually talk about its cast of characters. First off is the famous Haran Banjo. Banjo is dashing, daring, has the fighting skills of a Hollywood action hero, can bend steel beams with his bare hands, is a genius at the sciences, sometimes, and has a host of ridiculous weapons and gadgets. He's usually having a great time. Haran Banjo's name is something of a pun. If you spell it with different characters, it reads stormy and dramatic. He's a very entertaining character. Next we have Beauty Tachibana. Beauty is a rich heiress whose absent-minded father owns a spaceship company. There's some insinuation that her father knew Banjo's father, more on that later. Regardless of any family connections, Beauty is here for love of adventure. Helping Banjo lets her play with jet cars, cool robots, and help save the world, and that's reason enough for her to stick around. Of the cast, she's the character most likely to succeed from luck or happenstance, but all the same, the show doesn't make her a fool, usually. Beauty is a nickname, of course. Her actual name is Beautiful. Reika Sanjo is an Interpol agent that became attached to Banjo after the first episode. How much of this is because the ICPO is interested in Banjo's efforts and how much of this is Reika just decided on her own to follow him, the show doesn't say. She's the smart one of the crew, and when the show needs someone who's capable and competent enough to keep up with Banjo, that's usually her. Reika stays cool under pressure and takes the threat of the Meganoids seriously. She's professional, comparatively, but even so, she clearly considers going on adventures with Banjo to be an enjoyable perk of her job. Garrison Tokita is Banjo's butler. He also maintains Banjo's panoply of gadgets, his garage of extravagant vehicles, and the magnificent Daitarn 3 itself. He also is employed to keep a watch out for Meganoid activity, is a capable combatant, trained marksman, and while the entire cast each gets a turn piloting the Daitarn 3 in one episode or another, he's the only one whose ability matches Banjo's. Garrison is aided in his various maintenance duties by the supercomputer ominously named Mother, as well as a host of cute helper robots called the Mecha Maru. And last we have Toppo. Toppo is the kid's sidekick that a lot of these shows seem obligated to have. In this case, we actually have the crew on record saying as much. I'm half tempted to defend Toppo's inclusion. He's by far one of the more tolerable one of those characters of one of those characters. He mostly doesn't get underfoot, he mostly doesn't spoil the good humor, he's thankfully kept distant from any of the show's raunchier moments, and sometimes he gets to kill bad guys. I'll give him positive wins above replacement. I've seen too many cartoon kid sidekicks that were so much worse to really hate the kid. All the same, he doesn't need to be here. We have the characters, and we know what they're about, but how did we get here? How did the famous Haran Banjo get his skills and strength and mansion and giant robot? The show doesn't explain this at first. Daitarn 3, the cartoon, shies away from straightforward exposition, and Banjo, the character, shies away from discussing his past. These aren't big secrets that are answered in a late reveal like in some shows. Instead, they're a handful of flashbacks or encounters with people from Banjo's past, which are salt and peppered across the series. These collectively show how he became the person he is. The show is designed around not having any plot continuity, and what plot there is presented anachronistically. You can watch any episode in any order and it wouldn't make any difference so long as you finished on the last episode. This is entirely a Monster of the Week affair, which I'm fine with because we get some good monsters. In Roger Ebert's review of the movie For a Few Dollars More, he described the film as being composed of situations and not plots. Plots were dangerous because if a kid went out to get some popcorn, he might miss something. This is a big divergence from the pattern set by other Sunrise Super Robot cartoons, where the trend had been for shows to have more continuity and to feature more of an overarching plot in each newer show. In fact, if you're familiar with other robot shows of this time, or with some of my earlier videos, you may notice that several elements in Daitarn 3 diverge from the typical formula. I have already discussed how the show's pacing and approach to animation were different, but let's also consider the characters. Zambot 3's lead, Kappei, is a child, and if Combatlers Hyoma and Voltus' Kenichi are teenagers, they're still not adults. They aren't presented as adults and don't behave like adults. Hyoma may own a motorcycle, but he does not own a house. He and Chizuru may be shown as boyfriend and girlfriend at the end of the show, but with any given episode they're just two kids. Likewise, Kenichi and his brothers might be royalty in a sense, but they're not decision makers. They pilot the robot on behalf of their father. That's about how things go, both within these handful of shows and with any of the dozen of other Super Robot shows of the era that I haven't covered. The lead characters are not adults. Haran Banjo owns a car. Haran Banjo owns property. He owns facilities. Haran Banjo owns the Super Robot. It's not the property of some science foundation or secret military force, it's his, personally. He owns it, and he employs someone else to take care of it, and he fights the Meganoids with it because he chooses to. Haran Banjo is not in the same socio-political situation as Yusha Raiding's Akira, a school kid who pilots out of an obligation to his community, and he's not in the same economic bracket as the host of protagonists who pilot their robots as basically their day job. And Banjo doesn't have a will they, won't they relationship with the girl next door. He lives with two women in his mansion with his butler. This is a very different dynamic. Let me emphasize, the show may not be explicit, but the three of them are presented as a throuple. Like, that's the dynamic. Beauty and Reika may tease each other over who will marry Banjo, but it is teasing. Often they get along better with each other than with Banjo, who frequently finds himself getting caught up in whatever the two of them have going on. And if 3 is not enough, you'll be happy to hear that a semi-common plot beat is another woman joining in for an episode, or in one notable case, a guy. This ain't some Tenchi Muyo style, why doesn't the guy just get with everyone? This is the guy has gotten with everyone, so with that out of the way, let's get on with the show. Now granted, this is all presented in more of a libertine 70s manner as opposed to being progressively pro-poly or anything like that. But regardless, it's there, and that's kinda great. This is certainly primarily a heavily cis-hetero juvenile fantasy of a cool guy living in a mansion with his 2 beautiful girlfriends, but still blows most other contemporary cartoons, at the very least, out of the water in its realizations of its characters and their relationships. Beauty and Reika are fun, entertaining characters. If they're occasionally the butt of a joke, it's to no greater extent than Banjo. And while Daitarn 3 does have some cheesecake, the show is surprisingly equal opportunity in that regard. In a way that kinda rules, even if I'm astonished they got away with some of this. Should they have shown that in a kids show? Well, it aired decades ago and I'm watching it as an adult, so I don't have to care. I'm getting off topic. My point is that previous Super Robot shows were firmly in their routines and held close to their cliches. Making Banjo independently wealthy and successful in its relationships upsets many of the basic assumptions of the Super Robot show formula. Banjo isn't a mecha pilot first and foremost, and the Meganoids aren't at the forefront of each and every episode. Sometimes Banjo gets into exciting adventures that don't initially involve the Meganoids, and many of the Meganoids' evil plots don't initially involve giant robots. They just need to truck one out to turn into a Megaborg to handle Banjo. This makes Daitarn 3 less a quote-unquote super robot show, so much as an adventure show that just happens to have a super robot. Which works really well, and of course it does. That's how most modern robot shows are structured. Frankly, it's a little astonishing this approach wasn't more common earlier. You'd think it'd have been obvious. Paradoxically, being freed from those earlier tropes makes Daitarn 3 almost more super robot-y than its predecessors. Being freed from routine lets it use the super robot to greater effect. A typical show from this period will have one 2 to 4 minute robot fight before the commercial break, and then a second 2 to 4 minute robot fight after the commercial break. Daitarn 3 almost never has the robot show up before the commercial break, but it's willing to have the entire back half be a robot fight. Some episodes, not every episode but some, have robot fights that last 8 minutes long, all of which are animated as extravagantly as the rest of the show. But I really shouldn't talk about the fights before introducing the contenders. The Meganoids are former humans turned into cyborgs, originally for the purpose of colonizing Mars. At some point, their intentions have changed, and while their ultimate goals are kept hidden from the viewers, at least at first, they involve or permit a great deal of hostility toward the unaltered humans of Earth. There is some implication the Meganoids cannot reproduce and are therefore dependent on humans to grow their population. The vast majority of Meganoid schemes involve either recruiting or kidnapping human candidates. In charge of such schemes are Meganoid commanders, more powerful Meganoids who have been given the power to transform their bodies into Megaborgs, this show's evil giant robot. The commanders in turn answer to Don Zother and his lieutenant Koros. Don Zother, who's at the damn apex of villainous character designs, is completely and perfectly in charge. Part of being a Meganoid, as opposed to being a cyborg more generally, is their loyalty to Don Zother is built in. This is not an absolute loyalty. Multiple Meganoids either defy him or else interpret their orders loosely, but it does take some active will on their part. This is a major problem, because whatever process turned Don Zother into the boss Meganoid has seemingly left him unable to communicate. Instead, his wishes are voiced by Koros. And while this situation is a little comical, this ambiguity is also the source of quite a bit of animosity from the commanders. Several of them aren't convinced of Koros' sincerity, a few of them plainly resent her, and this gap in communications is used as leverage around their coerced loyalty. Most every episode focuses around a particular Meganoid commander whose personal idiosyncrasies or obsessions color whatever nefarious plot they've been assigned to enact. Don Zother and Koros usually make an appearance once an episode as well, checking in on whomever to make sure they have their act together. And make no mistake, every Meganoid commander has some idiosyncrasy and zero have their act together. Many episodes revolve more around their villain than the heroes. Episode 10's Wong Law is a popular action star who becomes a Meganoid in the hopes of fulfilling his dream of starring in a perfect hit martial arts film. To this end, he uses his cyborg strength to challenge Banjo to a fight. This pisses Don Zolther and Koros off. Pursuing personal glory ain't exactly furthering the Meganoid cause, but there's not much they can do to re-establish control when they're on Mars. We get an ominous line about Haran Banjo not being the little kid who fled from Mars years ago, put a pin in that, but before their fight scales upward. Wong Long becomes a Megaborg, Banjo calls for Daitarn 3, the film cameras come out, and Banjo wins. Later we're shown the film premiere. It's a big hit. Earlier, Wong Long mentions that he wasn't able to make it as a film star as a human, and that all of his success came after he had undergone the Meganoid transformation. This is a typical story behind many of the Meganoids, although Wong Long comes out better than most. He does, after all, get his film. Other lunatics that become Meganoid commanders include the guy who captures passenger transport vehicles. Supposedly, this is so he can turn their passengers into Meganoids, but in truth, this is an excuse to shrink the vehicles down with his shrink ray so he can grow, so to speak, his collection of miniature vehicles. The guy who became a Meganoid purportedly to help turn other people to Meganoids, but in actuality he just wanted the training so he could pursue his true interest, surgically turning people and horses into centaurs. The guy who runs a museum of war machines that became a Meganoid so he can put all his cool tanks to use, and in the process maybe build a brand new mega tank. The evil musician whose music hypnotizes people and who uses illusions to attack the heroes, but whose true ambition is to go behind Don Zolther's back to Koros. This one is actually a standout episode. Good humor, the villain's illusions get entertainingly kaleidoscopic, and we get to see Banjo in his skivvies for a good portion of the runtime. The episode also drops some hints that Koros is actually running operations with Don Zolther being only a figurehead, maybe. And, good news, the stories of people becoming Meganoids to get things they otherwise couldn't veers into the erotic at times. Episode 30, which I have labeled the Sapphic Forced Cyborgification episode in my notes, features a Commander Mizzoni, who's maybe a little too gung-ho about turning women into her loyal Meganoid subordinates, to the point that she lets her male captives go free. Koros straight up asks her, hey, are you maybe being too much of a freak about this whole thing? The episode also goes quite a ways into hinting at the internecine conflict within the Meganoids. Mizzoni confesses to Banjo that she actually hates Meganoids. She intends to use her victory over Banjo as a pretext to get close enough to Koros to assassinate her, and comforts Banjo that after she does, Banjo and his family will be avenged. What's that all about? Don't ask. You're not finding out in this episode. Another episode that plays becoming a mind-controlled Meganoid for erotic horror is the previous episode 29. In this one, a couple who decided to become Meganoids so they could stay beautiful and live together for eternity have relationship turmoil after it turns out one of them has a thing for Banjo. Koros tries to come to the rescue on this one, explaining that if they simply turn Banjo into a mind-controlled cyborg, the two of them could just keep him as their pet. That's called lateral thinking. For something in a different direction, episode 37 has the Sidekick Squad kidnapped by a surprisingly gracious Meganoid commander, Kitogawa, as bait for drawing out Banjo. Kitogawa airs his grievances with Banjo's easy success and the comfortable life he's bought with the pile of gold he stole from Mars years ago, compared to Kitogawa's more honest struggles that have brought him far more limited success. What's that about stolen Martian gold? Again, don't bother asking. This ain't that episode. Banjo easily bests him, demands the release of the hostages, and Kitogawa complies. As they fly home, they discuss how he made a good host, and Banjo states that Kitogawa wasn't a bad guy. The two of them share a rivalry, and Kitogawa has always been a little too obsessed about it. Once more, we have a Meganoid that doesn't care about forwarding any sort of Meganoid agenda. His subordinates whip up a plot where they try to trick Banjo and Kitogawa into each believing the other has renegaded on their détente, and while they attack each other, the treacherous subordinates re-kidnap the sidekicks to try and force a victory. Kitogawa, furious at this deception, destroys the other Meganoids and rescues the hostages himself. Something that might not come across in my retelling, but which doesn't come across in the animation, is how much the fight between Meganoid, now Megaboard Kyogawa, and the Daitarn 3 is framed as play. These are two former friends rekindling an old rivalry. Kyogawa is one of only a handful of Meganoid commanders who survives his episodes, and while he cannot return to being human, Banjo makes it clear that he wants to continue their friendship. The framing is more than a little romantic.
Yaruga? Yosh, yaruze! Yoi! Done!
These type of situations, where a commander is driven by some obsession that doesn't align with the Meganoid leadership, are extremely common. Meganoids are largely people with some particular problem or some particular obsession that, in hopes of an easy solution, lead them to choose to become a questionably loyal cyborg soldier of the bad guys. If you've seen any modern anime or tokusatsu show or the like, you're probably seen this setup before. It's an easy way to gin up an endless host of monsters of the week while keeping them personable and distinct. Gaigar does this, Precure does this, it's everywhere. Not to argue that Daitarn 3 came up with it, even 1978 is too late for that, but I do suspect this is an earlier example. It's certainly a more tragic example. A handful of Meganoids survived their matchup with Banjo, but not many. If you got turned into a Zonder and Gaigar, you'd be rescued and turned back human by that green boy with the fairy wings. If you got turned into a Desertarian and Hardcats, you'd be rescued and turned back into a human by the Precures. If you got turned into a Meganoid in Daitarn 3, you'd probably be shot and killed. But that's not to say we can't have a laugh about it. Daitarn 3 is structured like a comedy show, and the show has no better clown than the basic Meganoid trooper. Whether they're being shot, kicked off a cliff, chopped into pieces, bowled over by Banjo's patrol car, they're always having a blast, and it's always worth a smile to see them slaughtered. These are all actors, I promise. In fact, these are several actors. The voice cast for the show is extensive on account of the villains keep dying. The show can play the carnage for drama and pathos at times, but the average episode is a lighthearted adventure against opponents who are something between Power Rangers putties, the 87 Ninja Turtles Foot Clan, and any given generic mook from whatever kids show. Except you see them get killed, which is charming. So how does this fit in with the whole Meganoids are all obsessive thing? For that, I can actually go straight to the source. Quoting scriptwriter Kenichi Katsuzaki, "In general, the commanders were all what we'd now call otaku. Mr. Hoshiyama said this as well, but commanders were invariably obsessed about something. Their soldiers cheered them on too. They're almost like a hobbyist club. So commanders are the club presidents and soldiers are the members." Now, someone more skeptical might ask if that isn't a twee comparison by someone who knows they're being interviewed in a robot hobbyist magazine and wants to compliment its audience. But no, the show backs them up completely. Not only that, the comparison itself is used in the show as a source of humor. In episode 19, Meganoid Commander Buncher and his allotted 2 henchmen are shown using their hidden moon base as a clubhouse. Buncher's villainous plot to exploit the agricultural potential of the planet by cutting it in half with a giant space chainsaw receives what I would describe as an appropriate reaction from the higher-ups, and they decide not to give him the resources he needs to accomplish his plan. Without being able to accomplish their fiendish plan, Buncher and his cronies just spend the days having fun until they manage to antagonize the heroes. It's kind of a reversal of the whole Utina-style student council that runs the world. Here is the evil world-conquering tyrants who aren't giving you enough funding to build that planet-slicing machine you want, so you just shoot the shit in your clubhouse instead. And if that episode is the most on the nose about it, it's not without competition. Episode 22 sees Haran Banjo protect the sort of Met Gala in space. When the celebrities start cheering him on, the enemy Meganoid commander trots out his own cheerleaders to back him up. And he has a fandom among some of the humans as well. But all of that is really a minor part of the episode, which is primarily an excuse to cameo a ton of Hollywood actors. But enough about Meganoids who are geeky losers who inevitably get slaughtered by the heroes. How about a couple episodes about Meganoids who are geeky losers who survive and make the heroes look like chumps? Episode 9 features Commander Franken, Discipline Director of the Meganoid Force. Commander Franken is assigned to come to Earth to capture Maria, a rogue Meganoid who has been sentenced to reconditioning after, gasp, falling in love. The episode is end-to-end gags of Franken pursuing Maria only to be humiliated as Banjo nobly protects the refugee, and ends with the fun if obvious reveal that Maria fell in love not with Banjo but with Franken himself, with Banjo being left on the hook like a complete doofus. Banjo has the good grace to help the two of them establish lives hidden on Earth afterwards. Come some dozens of episodes later, then the new Discipline Director, Commander Jiraiya, is assigned to bring in both Maria and Franken in a rare direct follow-up. As Koros fears Jiraiya might pull the same trick, she sends her own agent, Sumika, to tail him. Koros feels secure doing this as Sumika eagerly voices her disdain for Jiraiya. And you won't guess what happens next. This is another episode that's largely gags, with Jiraiya and Sumika acting as competing cliché ninjas whose plans disastrously collide. Things finally go south for Jiraiya, and he's left as a dead man walking with a damaged power unit. Sumika graciously tears out her own power unit, lying that as a direct servant of Koros she's been given a spare. Later, as Sumika slowly begins to die in Jiraiya's arms, Banjo steps in and gives the two of them a power unit straight from the Daitarn itself. The two Meganoids then live happily ever after, which, for cyborgs, is presumably a very long time. And if you're wondering how their powers could possibly be compatible, it's because the Daitarn was originally built by the Meganoids, of course. Daitarn 3 is remarkably free of the tonal dissonance common in many 70s anime. The constant gags, cheap jokes, and physical humor smooth out any unevenness what might have otherwise been heavy subject matter. It can make the villains tragic, humorous, doofenshmirtzian, or honestly and truly wicked, and the lightheartedness means it mostly all lands. It's very Hanna-Barbera in a sense, very Saturday morning cartoon.
あら、ジライヤ。
知ってるのバンジョ。
ああ、変わったやつだったんでね。よく覚えてるよ。
メガノイドなんて変わったやつばっかじゃない。
あいつは特別でね、自称石川五右衛門13代目ってんだから。
合わせてくれたっていいじゃん。
It's no surprise that the show ran contemporaneously with Lupin the Third Part 2, which was produced after its short-lived original cartoon broadcast became popular in reruns. And if what happened with Lupin the Third sounds familiar, that might be because something curiously similar happened with Space Battleship Yamato and would later happen with Mobile Suit Gundam. These were all properties that failed with the younger audience but found success with teenagers. The animation industry was in process of adapting to, and in part creating, this teenage audience. And from that standpoint, when considering the Meganoids as obsessives, hobbyists, club members, and otaku, well, the typical person watching the show in the late 70s, or in the middle 2020s, is going to find it easier to identify with many of the Meganoid commanders rather than with Banjo or any of his crew. The heroes in some sense have already achieved all of their goals and are living their best lives in a group mansion with all the amenities. The Meganoids, in contrast, are aspiring to live their best lives. They're the ones we see putting in the work. And a lot of the individual Meganoids do have admirable goals which are only twisted to harmful ends. Commanders Isser and Risser from episode 29 want to be queer and beautiful and immortal forever, and also to keep the famous Haran Banjo as a pet. I wish nothing less for any of my own friends. The four lovebirds who flee to Earth, Banjo's rival with romantic undertones Kidogawa, and a handful of other good Meganoids paint a picture of being a Meganoid as an obsessive cyborg is basically fine, just so long as whatever special interest you have isn't hurting anyone. It's mostly just Don Zalther and Koros' regime that's bad. What the leadership promises can be enticing, though. Submitting to them can help you achieve what you want, but as a Meganoid, you're not supposed to promote any personal cause. Rather, you're meant to promote the acquisition of power by the Meganoid leadership. Presumably, after they control humanity, they can simply eliminate lesser oppressions. However, Don Zalther and Koros have intentions for the Meganoid people that are more specific than that. Most super robot shows take place in a vague near-future setting, albeit the near future of the 1970s. There might not be flying cars and jetpacks, but there will be super electromagneticity or photon power. There will be powerful machines built from Chogokin, literal superalloys. Daitarn 3 mostly takes place in the regular 70s. It's only the Meganoid bad guys that have whatever super science nonsense the show will play with this week. Banjo may have a flying car and his giant robot, but the Meganoids built those too. The average schmuck in this setting might live in a world where cyborgs on planet Mars could levitate away the city they live in, but the personal computer hasn't been invented and telephones still plug into the wall. There are a few exceptions. Space travel is a thing for one, and notably Beauty's father is as rich as he is because he's involved in the space travel industry. But even then, there are hints that he has connection to the Meganoids via his association with Banjo's own father. I'll touch on that shortly. Another example of genuinely human future technology is the Magellan-class battleship, which is built by the human military. Controlled by the brain of the questionably deceased Admiral Magellan, this battleship proves very effective at countering Meganoid forces. However, as a person forced to live inside a machine, as he phrases it, the Admiral Magellan develops sympathies for the Meganoids and reaches out to them. Meganoid Commander Katrov is quick to respond. Haran Banjo, already present as a guest of the military, is present to speak on behalf of humans. Instead of being some philosophical Star Trek narrative where Katrov and Banjo debate their case before the Magellan, the battleship instead quickly declares himself superior to them both. Moreover, he has the strength to back it up, leading to Banjo and Katrov to join forces to oppose the human-built cyborg battleship. Commander Katrov is only too willing to work with Banjo, not because he's afraid of the Magellan per se, but because it terrifies him how much Koros admires it.
何か不満があるのか、コマンダーカトロ。
はい。お尋ねしたいことが一つあります。
申してみよ。
マゼランが我らメガノイドの求める理想の姿なのでありましょうか。
そうです。
ならば、あのようなものにはなりたくありません。この私の手で葬り去るまでです。
カトロ。
おら、ドンザウサー。
In their efforts to create a weapon capable of combating the Meganoids, the human military has merely produced a more extreme and more ideal Meganoid. One that has the admiration of the Meganoid leadership and which is every bit as defined by its former human idiosyncrasies, despite its dehumanized, disembodied form. This is a subtle thing that distinguishes the show. Most super robot shows are set in worlds that are on the cusp of a new age of technology, where they tap into that potential to defend against whatever invading force opposes progress. Daitarn 3 is set in a world in which the new age of technology, the science fiction transhuman potential, is the force invading it. Any attempt to create futuristic super science simply reproduces the Meganoids. So, what does this invading future actually want? Koros, speaking for Don Zother, voices his desire to have the Meganoids acquire enough power to flee from the solar system altogether. He wants them to live apart from the humans and thereby prevent further conflict. This, along with the fact that Don Zother is comatose and secretly has been this entire time, is revealed in the 40th and final episode of the show. As goofy as this is, it does recontextualize a lot of the earlier inter-Meganoid conflict. This Meganoid separatism is the key issue that Meganoids as an organization pursue, but few of the Meganoids individually desire. Many of the Meganoids were originally Martian colonists who may not have much loyalty to Earth, but several were Earth volunteers or victims. And regardless of their original home, all Meganoids have an obsession which is usually rooted in Earth human culture. Don Zother's goals, if achieved, would cut them off from this. If you're a fan of the later Gundam series, especially the Universal Century and Char's counterattack stuff, some of this may sound familiar. Mobile Suit Gundam's story involves the new type theory, where after leaving their birth world, mankind would hopefully uplift itself to a more universal consciousness and escape their old prejudices and limitations. The major difference is that in Gundam, this is thought to occur by some Age of Aquarius-style development of extrasensory perceptions or psychic powers, while becoming a Meganoid is strictly a surgical procedure. This hope of leaving the solar system explains Koros' appreciation of the Magellan battleship. An invincible ship self that could travel through space is precisely an achievement of Don Zother's goals. As it happens, it would also describe Computer Doll number 8, the big bad guy from the preceding show Zambot 3. Koros states that if the Meganoids could simply acquire enough power, they would leave the Earth alone. If this is true, why does the famous Haran Banjo oppose the Meganoids so fiercely? Partly it's because the very process of acquiring enough power could only happen at the expense of the people on Earth, who are being attacked by a wide variety of goofy mad scientist villain plots whenever they aren't being directly kidnapped and turned into mind-controlled cyborgs. But Banjo has a particular hatred for them beyond merely defending his fellow humans. In episode 36, a team of Meganoids hypnotize Banjo and incapacitate him by showing him a nice dream. He experiences a vision of his childhood from when he lived with his parents and his brother. In this dream, they're all alive and happy together. This makes Banjo furious. He cannot tolerate his father being happy. There's a risk of overstating things when talking about the show's plot. Daitarn 3 doesn't present its overarching narrative sequentially, rather bits and pieces are salt and peppered throughout the show without much structure. Nearly any given episode is just Banjo and Beauty and Reika and Toppo having exciting adventures fighting cliché villains. That being the case, let me give a quick rundown on some of the great and entertaining episodes which, for the sake of time, I will not be discussing. The Meganoid commander who attacks the Daitarn 3 with metal insects that enter its mechanisms and cause havoc. This forces Banjo to have to enter his own giant robot on foot and fight them off with guns. It ends with Beauty and Reika having to manually control the robot's limbs to fight the Megaborg. The shape-shifting Meganoid that quotes Cutie Honey and steals the Daitarn 3, leading Banjo to fight his own robot from a stolen Meganoid spaceship. The Meganoids who try to triangulate the location of Banjo's secret base only to mistakenly invade one of his next-door neighbors instead. The heretical Bio-Meganoids who seek to steal the technology of an ancient advanced civilization, leading the whole episode to roughly anticipate Laputa Castle in the Sky. The episode where Reika becomes psychic and fights the King of Atlantis. The episode with even bigger robots than Daitarn that renders all sense of scale nonsensical. Basically, the average episode is very fun and has absolutely zero to do with any ongoing plot. Exceptions, such as episode 12 that cram in Haran Banjo's whole backstory in 6 minutes of psychedelic flashback, are outliers. And even episode 12 is largely a fun, lighthearted episode with a pile of gags. But the villain happens to be a Meganoid who's undercover as a human banker who hopes to recover a pile of gold bars Banjo took with him when he fled from the planet Mars as a child. Banjo responds that the gold belonged to his family to begin with and that he has every right to it. And if you're wondering, hey, what's all that about? Just watch, as the show immediately cuts to one of the most visually striking scenes in a show that already looks quite good. We're shown young Banjo fleeing past the phantasmagoric, cyclopean cyber cityscape of abstract patterns, his memories painting the Martian facilities in monochromatic whites and blacks. He hears his mother's voice reverberate as if from a great distance, calling him to flee the planet and escape to Earth. She explains how there's a mother rocket prepared for him that has been loaded with that transforming robot and a quantity of gold bars allowing him to live his whole life as he wishes. But first he must flee before they notice. Astute viewers may catch some shots of the computer monitors and miscellaneous futuristic equipment which were originally drawn for the prior year's show Zambot 3. If I hadn't watched these shows back to back, I wouldn't have caught it. As a Meganoid craft intercepts the mother rocket, Banjo boards the Daitarn 3 for presumably the first time. The following spacecraft-to-spacecraft battle is all bright whites, solid blacks, and cool blues, only broken up by Banjo's fiery palette and the red and orange of exploding ships. If a normal person asked me to recommend one episode of Daitarn 3 to watch, I would, without hesitation, suggest episode 32, the one with the Meganoids who mistakenly attack their own mansion. But if an animation pervert asked me to recommend an episode, I'd tell them episode 12. This goes quite a ways towards explaining Banjo's history, but of course there's more to that story than just what we're shown in this one sequence. More is revealed a half dozen episodes later as Banjo encounters another refugee from Mars, his father's assistant, Dr. Minamoto. Dr. Minamoto explains that the Meganoids kept him alive and unmeganoided to preserve his skill as an engineer. When questioned by Banjo why he continued to create Meganoids as a captive, Minamoto explains that he did so because he still truly believed in Banjo's father's philosophy. Your father's project to build cyborgs wasn't fundamentally flawed, but mistakes were made, he states. We didn't account for the fact that cyborgs would turn against any human masters once they realized their own strength. After blithely admitting that the original intention for human cyborgs was as slave labor for human masters, Minamoto goes on to say that the solution is cyborgs with inbuilt loyalty. The earliest attempts at this are clearly the Meganoids in service to the, thankfully comatose, Don Zouther, but even those can be rebellious. Minamoto's ultimate goal was the creation of a cyborg that obeyed each and every order, an action he describes as following in Banjo's father's footsteps. I'm starting to wonder if Banjo's dad might not have been such a good guy. Two minor thoughts about this episode. First, interestingly enough, Minamoto actually survives, an incredible rarity for one-off characters in these older cartoons. He ends up fleeing the solar system in a stolen Meganoid ship. Secondly, this episode contains this incredibly smooth shot of a Meganoid commander standing up from his chair. Why was this animated on ones? With this additional context, let's take another look at episode 36, the one where Banjo was hypnotized by visions of his past. Banjo's family didn't just happen to be on Mars when the revolt happened. His mother just didn't happen to have access to a pile of gold and a giant transforming robot that she could pass on to her son. Haran Sozo, Banjo's father, personally played a direct role in the creation of a cyborg slave race designed as labor for terraforming Mars, with Daitarn 3 as a Megaborg prototype. Presumably, the gold was his payment, and the direct result of these actions was the death of his entire family, except for Banjo, and the creation of a despotic Martian state with a, frankly understandable, animosity towards humans.
メガノイドを作ったのは誰かな。何？人々を苦しめるメガノイドを作ったのは誰かな。父だ。僕の親父だ。そうだ。お前はこの父の子供だったな。そうだ。その父の子ゆえに僕はメガノイドに挑戦する男となった。バンジョー。メガノイドめ。僕はあらゆる悲しみも恐れもメガノイドと戦うための怒りに変えた男だ。
But yeah, in most episodes none of this comes up. It's mostly a lighthearted comedy where Banjo and his two girlfriends play at being James Bond and then a robot fight happens. Toppo is there too. So what did Haran Banjo bring back from Mars? What has he been doing with his stacks of gold besides buying a giant mansion? The answer to this gets into what the show is really about: selling toys. I'm going to start with another quote, this one from the 2003 Zambot 3 Daitarn 3 Chronicle. Eija Yamaura, head of the planning department for both shows, says this in regards to the merchandising. Because the toys for Zambot 3 sold so well, they let us do the following Daitarn 3 for a full year. The police car that transformed into an airplane was a big seller at the time, and Mr. Okawara even made a transforming wooden prototype for it. Actually, there was also a plan to transform from a police car into a robot, but for various reasons that was dropped. The story of the Clover Toy Company, which produced the toys for Daitarn 3, is both tragic and a little humorous. They'd fund a number of robot cartoons that Sunrise would produce, the majority of which were directed by Yoshiyuki Tomino. Tomino's shows after Daitarn 3 would be somewhat more cerebral, aimed at an older audience, and would prove a pretty poor match for the toys aimed at 5 to 9-year-olds Clover would continue to produce. This leads to the wonderful anecdote where Clover goes bankrupt because they couldn't make money selling Gundam toys. This is before then. Daitarn 3 was a remarkable success for Clover, as the Martian weaponry the famous Haran Banjo brought to Earth proved quite marketable to young boys. The full extent of Haran Banjo's armaments are rarely shown. Yes, he has a flying car and his giant robot, available now in stores near you, but that's just the beginning. Under the ocean offshore from his home is an extensive manufacturing plant and hangar. This is the home of the Mechamaru that repair and maintain the Daitarn 3 robot between episodes. It also houses the mother rocket he came to Earth on. This is also where he slowly constructs the weapons he'll require for his return to Mars, including additional mother rockets and Daitarn 3 robots. These facilities give the appearance of being mostly self-run by the mother computer, presumably transplanted from the mother rocket, and are ultimately directed by Garrison. The whole of this underwater facility is kept almost entirely as a background detail that only shows up once every 10 episodes or so. It does come to the forefront very occasionally, such as the episode where Toppo wanders in and cajoles the mother computer into causing mischief. There's a sense where Banjo's cool, automated underwater manufacturing plant can also be seen as a tool for promoting toy sales, even if there wasn't a toy underwater base or Mechamaru toys actually being sold. Which is a shame, I would totally buy a Mechamaru. There's a broader cool science vibe to the whole bit that funnels back into the toys that did exist. The fictional infrastructure is cool in a way that makes the product desirable, in the same way that the famous Haran Banjo being cool makes the toy robot more desirable. So let's talk about the big cool robot of 1978's Daitarn 3, which, in an act of uncanny synchronicity, is also called the Daitarn 3. I don't really care for it. I don't. It's fine, I guess. Lord knows the 70s produced ugly robots, but it's far from my favorite. It's got boxy square limbs and these weird hollow pauldrons made from the airplane mode's nose cone, and it's just very, very generic. Each of its non-robot transformations are abstract. It has this thing where the transformation is very rigid, but the results are kind of wacky, which is kind of the reverse of what I like. Getter Robo-style transformations are more my style. You can't build a functioning toy of the Getter Robo, however, and Daitarn 3 is clearly designed within the limits of what the Clover Toy Company could produce in mind. The design works in motion, but that's because its animators were some of the best in the business and they imbued it with a lot of character. Yoshinori Canada giving it facial expressions in particular makes it come across as a lovable fella. Just don't compare any of its designs with any of the lead robots from director Nagahama's Robot Romance trilogy, all of which look way cooler to my eye. Although, maybe we should. If we look at it on a height comparison chart, we see that the Daitarn 3 is twice as tall as most of its contemporaries. It's like a little secret joke. If you're enough of a nerd to go tracking down cartoon robot heights, your reward is learning that the famous Haran Banjo simply has a larger robot than any of the boy heroes from any of your other cartoons. That must be why he's famous. It's also worth pointing out how the Daitarn 3 is not a combining robot. This is probably just because a doofy transformer was easier for Clover to engineer than a multi-part combiner, but the result is that Banjo is the only pilot, barring episodes where he lets someone else take the wheel. Beauty and Reika have their own separate vehicles that they use, but it's not like they pilot Daitarn 3's arms and legs. Bizarrely, I think this is to their benefit. In robot shows of this era, the girls who pilot the robot tend to be lesser characters compared to girls who don't. Let me back this up. Marie from Yusha Raidin is a more active character that does more things and is more involved in any given episode of her show than, say, Chizuru from Combattler V. I suspect that Chizuru being a Quinary pilot gave the writers an out for what to do with her. She's one of the 5 pilots, that's the thing she does. But when you have a girl character who isn't a pilot, you actually have to find something for her to do. Likewise, Aki and Michi from Zanbao 3 are both incredibly important characters to that show's narratives. Their stories are central to the show's themes. And then there's Keiko, who's just kinda there. She wears the green pilot's outfit. Beauty and Reika are great characters. They're expressive, they have defined personalities, and either one of them can step in to drive any episode's story. They don't have an elaborate tragic backstory of their own giant robots like Banjo does, but they go on adventures, kick ass, and do things. If it seems like I don't discuss them as much as Banjo, that's because elaborate tragic backstories and giant robots make easy hooks for things to talk about, unfortunately. Sorry, girls. Getting back to the Daitarn 3 robot itself, it's a Meganoid creation. It's described as a prototype of what would become the Megaborg transformation. It has parts compatible with the Meganoid biology. It's all Meganoid tech. Remember, this is a show where the only real super science is associated with the bad guys, and that makes this one of the few 70s Super Robot cartoons where the robot was built by the bad guys. There is some precedent with earlier non-animated giant robot shows, such as Mitsuru Yokoyama's Giant Robo, and the concept is all over Shotaro Ishinomori's work, see Cyborg 009 and Kamen Rider. But within animated super robots, I'm pretty certain this is a first. You see it much more in later shows. That brings me to the final question of Haran Banjo's inheritance. Is Banjo a Meganoid? The show frequently hints that Banjo is in some way superhuman, with he himself slyly drawing comparisons between the Meganoid's impressive capabilities and his own skills. If you haven't seen the show and you're only hearing me describe it, you might think this is a jab at the Meganoids in a they think they're so great but I can do all this too sort of way. But that really isn't how it's presented. Banjo genuinely respects the Meganoids' power, however he feels about them as people, but also he can match that power. Granted, this is hard to square. Some Meganoids oppose Koros, but few oppose Don Zother. Banjo's blatant mission against the Meganoids' leadership might be impossible if he were one. But could Banjo be a cyborg? The show does differentiate between cyborgs and proper Meganoids. A Meganoid is not just any modified human, they are a very particular thing with a high propensity for odd behavior and idiosyncratic motivations. Bringing back what scriptwriter Kenichi Katsuzaki said, they're invariably obsessed about something. Could Banjo then be some other type of cyborg? I think there's some evidence for it. The show never comes right out and says so, but it continues to draw comparisons between Banjo and the Meganoids. The show could turn this around on the viewers, a sort of you thought he was a cyborg but he was just that athletic and strong and cool sort of twist, but as before, that never happens. We're just left with the repeated suggestion that the son of the man who designed the Meganoids, and whose own brother was turned into a cyborg by said father, just happens to be way stronger and faster and tougher than the other humans. Anyways, Banjo doesn't much like his dad or the Meganoids. For some reason. There are a handful of episodes I'd like to mention to some extent, but which really don't fit into the video as a whole, so I'm going to squeeze them in now. Episode 16 is one of the rare bad episodes of this show. A gang of teenage delinquents flirt with joining the Meganoids as a form of rebellion against their strict fathers, and this leads them to attack the heroes. This put the man whose stolen gold funds his opulent life, living in a big house with 2 girlfriends, in the position of reasonable authority figure who has to guide the lost youth back to polite society. Without even touching the very conservative viewpoint of the episode, the premise just doesn't work. Banjo's character isn't built to act in that role. Anyways, Banjo manages to save the teens without killing them, and they pledge to, quote, do something good by enrolling into the military. Whatever. The episode is bad. Has a cute gag with the chicken, but that doesn't save it. Whatever. Another kind of bad episode is 34, where the Meganoid commander decides to forego the whole turning into a Megaborg to fight the Daitarn thing, by instead building multiple giant robots from the Daitarn 3's original blueprints instead. This happens at the same time as revealed that Banjo has also built multiple Daitarns in the hopes of having Beauty, Reika, and Toppo back him up in his eventual attack on Mars. It's a clip show. The bad guy giant robots are just Megaborgs from previous episodes, only now they dock in hangars and have pilot hatches hastily drawn on. The good guy giant robots don't team up and aren't on screen together. Toppo is in some desert, Beauty and Reika are in space, they all fight their own battles separately. It's a clip show. Every Daitarn but Banjo's original gets busted. They don't show up again. It's a clip show. This episode pissed me off. But it is interesting as an artifact showing where the genre was at the time. Super robot shows of this era almost exclusively feature the good guys fighting giant monsters. The monster might be robotic, but it's rarely a robot per se. Certainly not in the manner that the good guy robot is a robot. Shows where the good guy has their robot and the bad guy has their own robot and they fight robot to robot start in earnest with next year's Mobile Suit Gundam. It's a little reminiscent of Voltus 5's Mechanical Bird, where the viewer is led to expect something cooler than what the show can actually deliver. You can't actually introduce an evil Daitarn 3 or a multiple variant good guy Daitarn 3s because the toy company's only selling toys of the one design, and you can't get away with marketing a toy that doesn't exist. This touches on what might be the biggest weakness of the show. It just came out too soon. The anime industry would grow rapidly in the 80s. A whole host of new ideas what you can do in a giant robot show is just around the corner. And while Daitarn 3 is in many ways on the crest of that wave, that still means it doesn't benefit from how much further the form would mature. The idea of the evil version of the good guy's robot just didn't exist at the genre at this time, as wild as that may seem. And really, why would it? Toy companies aren't going to make money selling bad guy robots. To speak on an episode I actually did like a lot, let's look at episode 8. This is a rudimentary and maybe a little mean-spirited drama, where Reika's old school friend aspires to become a Meganoid commander because she's bitter at having her teenage crush spurn her for Reika for her being too moody. This feels more like a plot point from a very different show, some Sachurin shoujo teenage boarding school piece or the like. It's a little off-putting seeing a grown woman carry this middle school grudge. But here's another thing, Jira, the classmate in question, kicks ass. The show doesn't just present her as some cruel ice queen. Her Megaborg form distinctly recalls The Snow Queen from the 1957 feature animation directed by Lev Adamanov, except with more physicality. Look at that musculature and the thick black line work. Here is more American comic book influence showing through again. It's all very Jack Kirby. On top of that, this is one of those episodes where nearly a third of the runtime is dedicated to the robot fight. Jira fights the Daitarn as a Megaborg for 7 straight minutes and every second of it rules. The show makes her look absolutely incredible and gives her one of the most suspenseful and best looking fights of the entire cartoon. It's a plotline that would come across as derivative, or worse, in nearly any other show, but which Daitarn 3 is able to elevate through sheer level of craft. This cartoon does not always run on all cylinders, but when it does, it can be incredible. For most of the show, the Meganoid leadership stays entirely in the background. They're distant, they're on the other side of the monitor, they're a concern, but at any given moment they're not the concern. One exception to this is, not surprisingly, the final episode. But another is episode 20. This episode sees Koros move against Banjo directly. She has her forces target communication satellites on Earth to bait him and his companions out, after which she uses Meganoid hyperdimensional rifting technology to separate them. Capturing the sidekicks proves almost too easy, as the little spaceship Beauty and Reika were commanding is woefully under-equipped, which results in one of Garrison's better deadpans. Then the episode does the thing a lot of Daitarn 3's better episodes do, and it gets a little bit psychedelic. Banjo enters the hyperdimensional rift with the Daitarn, finding himself in a brightly colored alien landscape dominated by Koros' colossal spaceship of shining metal and precarious spikes. The better fraction of this episode is Banjo and Koros face to face, trading barbs, trading threats, and eventually trading blows. And it rules because it gives you a real sense of Koros' character after her being in the shadows for so long. It also rules because it's full of great lines, like her calling Banjo a good boy who should be more compliant. She attempts to coerce Banjo into surrendering by threatening the lives of a mind-controlled Beauty and Reika. This fails when Banjo coldly shoots Beauty with a gun. Banjo recognizes that it's an imposter because Beauty and Reika were drawn in different clothing at the start of this episode. Koros and Banjo fight. While Koros seems to get the upper hand, Banjo is rescued by the real Beauty and Reika, who have escaped confinement with the help of high-powered rifles they had hidden under their clothing. As the melee continues, the real Beauty gets held up by Koros, who once again tries to coerce Banjo to surrender. Banjo may have been willing to kill fake Beauty, what about the real thing? Banjo apologizes to Beauty, saying that, sadly, he's not skilled enough to kill Koros and save her life at the same time. And then he approaches Koros with his gun loaded. Fearing for her life, Koros abandons her captive and flees. At the end of the episode, Banjo, safe back at his mansion, ruminates over how miserable Koros seemed. What the episode does, besides being excellent entertainment, is to provide a more personal look at the big villains of the show. Koros, the villain who proclaims humans to be puny and useless and who prefers her opposition to be compliant, is a real character in the way that Koros, the woman on the other side of the monitor who proclaims she'll get Banjo next time Dr. Claw style, is not. I firmly believe good heroes need good villains. Koros being a complex and full character provides room for Banjo to be the same. We can buy his determination to kill Koros even at Beauty's expense, but also his later sympathy for Koros. When the episode ends on him contemplating what it'd be like to be a mind-controlled slave to Don Zalther, it feels like a true moment of introspection. Allowing itself to be serious expands the design space for the show. Banjo didn't kill any of his companions this time, but all of a sudden that's on the table. It's a little gutsy for the show to even present such a thought, and it gives a little, let's say, flavor to the rest of the comedic episodes. Even when you laugh, you find yourself asking, how far will he go to defeat the Meganoids? And this works in the other direction just as much, of course. The drama in this episode hits harder because the show is more often a comedy. I keep finding myself comparing the show with Lupin III, where the fact that the character can be played with more or less levity lends both approaches more weight. Let's take a moment to look at Koros. Much like Yusha Raideen's Prince Sharkin paved the way for a whole style of similar villain, Koros will likewise become an archetype for several characters that follow her. Cecilia Zabi, Harulu Ajiba, and Haman Karn are all clear examples of the Koros type of evil woman that was briefly common to Yoshiyuki Tomino shows. Which, to be clear, I approve of. These are all very compelling characters. But it is funny to think that the genesis of this comes from Daitarn 3 of all shows. Like, Char being an evolution of a character from a show where a soccer player pilots a giant robot feels sensible because Char is kind of a kid show type character. He's the obligate rival who gets his ass kicked and then scurries away. But to learn that Harulu Ajiba has her origin in a show that stars a James Bond XP who pilots a giant robot is maybe more surprising. A small aside. In the early English mecha fandom, before Daitarn 3 was fully fan-subbed and the show was more speculated upon than actually seen, there was a somewhat popular theory that Koros was Banjo's mother after being made into a Meganoid. And no. It might sound cute, but that's just not what we're presented. If you do want to go digging for Freudian nonsense, there's plenty to find. Banjo's secret base is operated by the mother computer. He escapes Mars on a mother rocket prepared to him by his actual mother who he had to abandon, and conversely, he expresses an intense animosity towards his dead father. But in the cartoon we have, Koros isn't connected to any of that. Their stories intercept, She recognizes him as the son of Haran Sozo and sees the irony of him opposing the Meganoids, but she's her own character. If you really want to pull for a crackhead canon, try this one. Is the Daitarn 3 Banjo's brother's Megaborg form? There's zero evidence, but I think it'd be fun. The conclusion of Daitarn 3, 20 episodes after the first showdown with Koros, is incredibly sudden. There's barely any lead up to it, and given that it has to conclude the entire show, a lot happens in it. It can feel jarring. It opens with an image of the planet Mars being propelled through space on gigantic rocket boosters. In desperation, Koros has decided to have the planet physically approach the Earth, in the process causing an environmental catastrophe. This will force the humans to flee the planet or bunker down, with either option leaving them easy pickings for Meganoid forces. Part of the plan is that the approach of Mars will precipitate certain atmospheric conditions that would limit the time spaceships can safely leave the planet. To avoid this bottleneck, Banjo, Beauty, Reika, Garrison, and Toppo will launch their counterattack straight through these hostile conditions. Garrison informs the audience the Mechamaru have built our heroes 4 additional mother rockets, for a total of 5, allowing each of our heroes to pilot their own. Beauty, Reika, Garrison, and Toppo engage the Meganoid space forces, while Banjo breaks through to attack the Meganoid command on Mars proper. One of the fleet admirals is astonished at the number of mega rockets that opposes Forcus and wonders aloud if that implies that there are 5 Daitarns as well. Boy, wouldn't that be cool. Sadly, Garrison explains that 1 Daitarn will have to be enough. While the battle rages in space, Banjo breaks through and crash lands in front of Don Zalther's fortress. He approaches, and his encounter with Koros here is far less articulate than in episode 20. As they fight, Koros tries to explain herself. She argues that humanity needs to evolve past life on the Earth. The only way forward is for them to roam space. She exclaims that Don Zalther's philosophy is correct and insists that Banjo should understand this as well. Banjo eloquently counters with, "I hate you," and, "When I look at all of you, all I see is my father's ghost." Folks, our hero. At some telepathic, or perhaps wireless signal of his beloved's distress, Don Zalther, who you'll remember has been comatose the entire run of this show up until now, finally awakens and makes his appearance. Take a moment and ask yourself, how could this show possibly have his character live up to 40 episodes of hype? By having him move like a damn phantom. This is an incredible moment and a perfect example of how this show is elevated by its style and craft. Don Zalther could have been like any other forgettable baddie, but in barely 10 seconds of animation he's made perfectly distinct from every other character in this show. He's shown to be a credible threat just from the way he moves. Banjo fights like an action hero. Don Zalther fights like he has a drive rush. Banjo has martial arts. Don Zalther has a command grab. Banjo likes to attack aggressively. Don Zalther is represented by the law firm of Izzy Plus and How. The man looks like a threat from another media simply because of how he's animated. It's incredible. Don Zalther remarks that, "Hey, it's weird how you look like a human, yet I'm somehow not able to crush you with my giant metal hands. Are you by any chance a Meganoid?" And Banjo, notably not disagreeing, replies, "Are you saying you've forgotten me, Haran Banjo?" Don Zalther, a little nonplussed, responds, "The son of the man, Haran Sozo, but Banjo is just a child. What have I been doing all this time?" What a line to drop! In a reversal of basically every other episode in which whatever enemy Meganoid has to turn giant to deal with a normal-sized Banjo, here Banjo has to call Daitarn 3 because he can't deal with a normal-sized Don Zalther. Where the leader of the Meganoids reveals an honest-to-God henshin device, Banjo is put right back on the back foot. Again, the animation does so much to sell how threatening Don Zalther is. It's not just that we see Banjo's weapons bounce off him, it's that he looks and moves like if Disney's Night on Bald Mountain was a versus Capcom character. This might not be the best animated or most thrilling fight in the series, it does have competition, but it is one you will remember. Just as things seem to be at their worst, Banjo hears his father's voice. "My son, you can win." The desperate emotions transmitted by Koros' brainwaves have caused Don Zalther to wake but for a moment. The human mind is such that... But before the disembodied voice can finish its thought, Banjo tells him to shut up. To hell with his father's post-mortem atonement, to hell with relying on family that has forsaken him, he will win with his own strength. Or so he says as he pilots the robot built by the Meganoids, which he maintains with his family's wealth as his allies continue the fight in space above him. Banjo uses Daitarn 3's Sun Attack finisher to hammer repeatedly at a single point in Don Zalther's armor, finally breaking through it and killing him. Koros, watching from below, succumbs to her injuries soon afterwards. Among fans of this show, Haran Banjo's next words are infamous. Something which doesn't come across in such a brief summary is the pacing. Episode 40 has to conclude the entire plot of the show, such that it is in some 20 minutes and change. It spends much of that runtime not in progressing the story, but in idly setting the mood. We watch Koros give a briefing to her lieutenants where she lays out her plan. We see our heroes spend a good 4 minutes chatting and keeping up each other's spirits before they finally board their space rockets. And after this final battle, the show cuts to an absolutely languid denouement. The super robot shows of the 70s mostly weren't science fiction. They had elements in common with science fiction, there is overlap with science fiction, but boy hero fighting monster villain with their respective improbable weapons ain't the same thing as using hypothetical developments as narrative device or telling a story about how progress will affect society. For the most part, Daitarn 3 is a typical super robot show, mostly notable for being produced on a low budget and compensating with an incredible amount of style. But it's not totally bereft of science fiction, especially in the particularities of its Meganoid villains. Other super robot shows may feature coercive surgery and mind control implants in one-off episodes, but none of them discuss the desire to become a monster that so often comes up in the backstories of various Meganoids. And by desire, I don't just mean that being a Meganoid will make you stronger and healthier, although it does, and I don't just mean that the Meganoid organization will help you get the things you want, although they will to a degree. I mean the show makes the very process of becoming a mind-controlled cyborg seem enticing at points. The show is, more than occasionally, horny about its mind control and body hoarder. I don't want to overstate this too much, this is still a kid's show, but it's there. And I think it's wild to see such an old cartoon have a handful of motives in common with, for example, the modern empty spaces literary movement. I want to be careful with how I phrase my thoughts. I don't want to say the Meganoids are secretly good guys, they aren't. But the show complicates them. Many were rote villains, not all of them. Factor in how the Meganoids were originally designed by Banjo's dad to be loyal slaves, and you're a stone's throw away from a story where the people who were turned into horses from Sorry to Bother You are the bad guys. Add in the genuine weirdness with Don Zalther's ideology, with the hope that the Meganoids will separate from mankind and roam as stars, possibly as transhuman cyborg spaceships, and you have something uncommonly idiosyncratic for a super robot show, something that is very science fiction. All of which collides into Banjo and his heroic super robot like a bird hitting a glass window. What's kind of shocking about this final episode is how Banjo isn't cool. He drops all pretense at self-control once he encounters Koros, and from then on he's a spiteful, impetuous, and very angry and very hurt. Afterwards, we see the heroes back at the mansion. Now that the Meganoids are defeated, Reika is heading out on her own. As she puts it, she and Banjo live in different worlds. Toppo is likewise leaving. Beauty pouts at how blasé their goodbyes are, but she's also heading home. Her rich father has his own mansion after all. And then Garrison locks up the gate and waits at a bus stop. It starts to rain. He taps his foot. A minute or so later, the bus finally arrives. And he leaves. The famous Haran Banjo does not make an appearance. He doesn't say goodbye to his friends. Later still, we see dawn breaking. The mansion is shown at a particular angle. Is there a light on? Or is it just the trick of the sun? Cards on the table. I came into Daitarn 3 with tempered expectations. Let me explain why. Any examination of giant robot shows produced in the 70s has to at some point acknowledge Mobile Suit Gundam. It's the big one in a way that colors the entire genre from that point onwards. That in turn means there is a strong interest in looking backwards to see what influenced it. This is especially true when discussing the robot shows of its studio, Sunrise Incorporated. From Yusha Raiding to Combattler V to Voltus 5 and Zambot 3, there's a loose but definite line of progression in themes and storytelling. The people creating these shows were making their villains more complex, their characters' motivations increasingly political, and were becoming more comfortable playing with tragic elements. It's easy to see how this development would lead to something like Mobile Suit Gundam science fiction war story. So how does Daitarn 3's largely comedic Super Robots plus James Bond plus Charlie's Angels plus Star Wars approach fit into this progression, if it does at all? At first blush, it sure doesn't look like a stepping stone on the way to Gundam, the supposed actually important show. Is it just some orphaned branch on the genre's phylogenetic tree? Or to phrase the question more honestly, does anything about the show differentiate it from the dozens of others from the era, or is this basically just another 40 episodes of Combattler V, a show I already felt ran too long? I went into this script not knowing. Unlike what I've covered until now, the first time I watched Daitarn 3 was to produce this essay. And the answer was yes. Daitarn 3 absolutely forwards the genre in very clear ways. But to see how, you need to look past narrative innovation and look at stylistic innovation. Daitarn 3 takes inspiration from a broad selection of media, including a lot of Western pop culture. Each episode has a lot of forward momentum, there's a lot of action, usually some PG-rated sensuality, sometimes PG-13. It's very Hollywood. The anime industry was about to enter the 80s. Home video and laserdiscs are about to become a big thing. A lot more and a lot better feature-length productions were soon to come out of Japan. We are entering the OVA boom. The televised robot shows that immediately followed Daitarn 3 are not necessarily that much like it. You see a little bit of influence in later Sunrise production Trider G7, which also has an expressive robot. But outside of that, there's a handful of shows starring dark-haired, traumatized pretty boys, a handful of more traditional aimed at young boys cartoons, and of course, Yoshiyuki Tomino and Ryusuke Takahashi would each work to map out the boundaries of what would later be categorized as the real robot genre. But once you get into the middle 80s, you start seeing its influence. Many robot OVAs look a little bit like Daitarn 3 in a way. Some of its design sensibilities are visible in the television cartoons like Dan Cougar and especially in the Japanese-produced Transformer cartoons. And this influence persists into the following decades. The 90s had Evangelion and Big O and a handful of other distinct giant robot designs, but by volume these were a drop in the bucket compared to shows that either were or looked like Gundam, or shows that were or looked like the Transformers. These included not only the Transformers themselves, but also the Eldron and Brave series, as well as some other odds and ends. These might be called the talking super robot cartoons. These are shows that featured super robots who were characters in their own right. Characters who talked and showed emotions and had facial expressions. Even beyond animation, talking super robots are just a recognized aesthetic of giant robots, which is kind of everywhere once you know to look for it. There are Yu-Gi-Oh cards that are talking super robots. Many of the talking super robots look a little bit like Yoshinori Canada's take on Daitarn 3, but not quite precisely. This is the Daitarn 3 style filtered through the next generation of animators, and one prominent artist in particular. Masami Obari was an animator who entered the business in the 80s, and he has made himself a respected name in the mecha genre. He was involved in many of the Super Robot OVAs, including Dangaio and Gunbuster. He also worked on Dan Cougar, Transformers, the Brave series, and, well, dozens and dozens of robot shows throughout the decades. His style is synonymous with dynamic poses, strong lighting, and robots with very defined facial features. To be clear, he's drawn and animated robots in several styles, and not all of them look like Daitarn 3, but many of them do. So, can we draw any conclusion between his style and Canada's? Well, Obari said he got into the animation business after a friend of his showed him episodes of Daitarn 3 and Zambot 3 on Betamax, episodes which were specifically animated by Canada. In fact, Obari has spoken quite a bit about Canada's influence on him. So yes, actually. Masami Obari is a big name with a long career. Covering it would be massively out of scope for this video essay. I will say that Obari has just directed Brave Bang Bravern last year, and that's about as concentrated a distillation of his style as you're likely to find, for better and for worse. And it does look a little bit Daitarn-like in parts. I'll also mention that while the Talking Super Robots style is probably past its zenith, its had long tail helped in no part by the long-running Super Robot Wars series of video games. Should I also talk about how Super Robot Wars drew from Daitarn 3? More than a couple of its original super robots are quite Daitarn-like. That's before I get into the robots animated in Obari's style, or just straight up animated by Obari. And it's been a joke for some years now how often the actual Daitarn 3 shows up, regardless of how appropriate it is for any particular game's narrative. But this is another case where there is so much to say it risks overwhelming the video. Suffice to say that stylistically, Daitarn 3 has had an outsized influence on the field of Japanese robot animation. It introduced a level of flexibility, personableness, arguably even softness, to the form which would become a very popular approach in the following decades. But all that isn't to say that Daitarn 3's influence is entirely stylistic, or to get back to what I was saying earlier, that it has zero connection to the following year's Mobile Suit Gundam. Gundam's new type theory, which is mostly only alluded to in the original show itself, shares a lot in common with Don Zalther's philosophy. Given that both shows shared so much crew, not the least being director Yoshiyuki Tomino himself, I have no question that the one's a refinement of the other. Likewise, Koro's weaponizing the planet Mars' doomsday weapon against Earth sets some precedent for many similar atrocities in Gundam, and in particular one of its sequel films. Beyond that, there's a number of minor details shared between the shows. Episode 35 has a reference to Meganoid Year 004, a future calendar that has clear parallel in Gundam's Universal Century Year 0079. Gundam also racializes its characters as being either Earthnoids or Spacenoids, terms that share a clear lexicon with Meganoid. Likewise, Daitarn 3's psychedelic flashbacks are a clear visual precursor of the seeing beyond time new type stuff towards the end of Gundam. And I know I mentioned Yoshinori Canada 24 times now, but the actual mechanical designer behind the Daitarn 3 was Kunio Okawara, who'd also designed the robots for Gundam. Okawara was already respected, but the Gundam would become his most iconic work by a league. Okawara also designed the White Base and the Hera robot, which were both originally Daitarn 3 designs that were recycled into the following year's show. The other big connection between Daitarn 3 and Mobile Suit Gundam is the character Haran Banjo himself. He's the son of an extremely pivotal man whose actions sparked the conflict of the show and to whom he has a complicated and antagonistic relationship. Banjo holds his father's successors partly responsible for his family's death and is primarily motivated by a personal quest for vengeance. Banjo is the prototype for Char Aznable. I find it funny how so many of the big ideas that help make Gundam as famous as it is have something of a first draft in Daitarn 3, a show it otherwise shares very little in common with. Gundam is often credited as being the first of the real robot cartoons. Daitarn 3 is much more of an unreal robot. Having said all that, it's difficult to view Daitarn 3 as an influence precisely. It was a testbed for some ideas, absolutely, but listening to Koros read out a rough draft of the new type theory isn't going to expand your appreciation of Gundam by much. And no Gundam fan has ever asked, what if Degwen Zabi became giant and Char had to fight him in his robot? It's charming we have an answer, but it ain't exactly Gundam. What Daitarn 3 really did was be a marketing success. In Great Mechanics G, which I've already pulled some quotes from, Koichi Inoue states, Daitarn 3 sold an awful lot of toys. The previous Zambot 3 already sold well, and Daitarn 3 sold even better. Apparently the sponsor Clover was able to upgrade its company building with the proceeds. It's for that very reason they were able to make a Gundam afterwards. Besides being visually and stylistically influential, and besides being the show before Gundam, Daitarn 3 was also a popular show, which has had a few references made to it throughout the decades. For one, the way Banjo summons the robot, where he poses with his pendant and shouts out, "Come here, Daitarn 3, can't be seen in a number of other shows. G Gundam's Domon Kashu summoning his Gundam, for example, or Gunsword's Van calling down Dan of Thursday for another. Daitarn 3 wasn't the first show to have its hero summon the robot, but to my eye, the manner in which Banjo does so was influential. Daitarn 3 is likely also a model for the basic situation of Big O. Both take after James Bond and Batman to a certain extent, but one takes after early comical James Bond and 60s live-action Batman, while the other takes after the somewhat more serious 90s James Bond and animated series Batman. These distinctions allow each show to strike a very different tone despite having very similar premises. I think the influence runs deeper than that, though. The whole world is a stage bit that Big O has pulled an awful lot from episode 36 of Daitarn 3. At one point in that episode, Banjo breaks into the backstage of the set the villains were using, and that imagery will be very recognizable to fans of Big O. I was genuinely shocked watching that episode and realizing, oh, that's where they got that from. A couple other things that are worth saying but don't really fit anywhere else in this video. Some of you may know that Yoshiyuki Tomino wrote several science fiction novels that took place in the settings of some of the cartoon shows he directed. The most well-known of these were in the Gundam and Dunbine settings, but he also wrote some Daitarn 3 novels, or at least some Haran Banjo stories. From what I understand, in these novels, Haran Banjo is something of a high-tech private eye who lives and works in a flying city that hovers over Tokyo Bay. Garrison is present not as his butler, but as the owner of a restaurant he frequents. There's no giant robot, but there are people with psychic powers. I can't say much more about the books. A handful of Tomino stories have had English translations, but not any of these. Finally, Daitarn 3 is also one of the 70s super robots that was shown in many countries in Europe, and it became very popular in Italy in particular. You can still find a good amount of Italian fan merch for the show. There's an Italian ska band named Meganoid that had a hit in the late 90s about how much it sucks to have the good guys kick your ass every episode. You know how it's going to end from the opening credits. And if your taste runs more disco than ska, listen to the Italian version of the opening theme song. The impact of 70s robot shows in Italy and elsewhere in Europe is not my video essay to make. It's not my field of expertise in the slightest, but I'd love to read or watch one. Everything I hear about it is really interesting. Daitarn 3 is a show very willing to play in different registers. Its ending, the "I'm sick of this" line, sticks with you. But the show has 40 episodes, and 39 of them aren't the last one. The show is a fast-paced action extravaganza of the coolest person your id can imagine, except when it's a phantasmagoric psychodrama, except when it's a comedy where the brunette girlfriend and the blonde girlfriend join up to fight evil robots, except when the robots are a cute couple who make the hero look like a dweeb, except when the robots are an older dominant woman with complicated relationships with their subordinate, except when the hero and his childhood rival are broing out, but it doesn't matter because the episode always ends with destroying the villain with a powerful sun attack in heroic fashion, except when it isn't heroic. Most of these episodes are great, with even the lesser ones having a few good moments. Daitarn 3 is a show I like a lot, and almost love. But, well, for one, it's a little aimless. Some more long-form narrative structure would have given it a much tighter total experience. For another, Daitarn 3 feels like a show that came out too soon. The animation industry was only just discovering the teenage market, and there's a lot about the show that would come across a lot better if it were aimed at a slightly older audience. Here's a hypothetical. Let's split Daitarn 3 in half. Let's put Banjo and his gadgets and toys in one show, and let's put Beauty and Reika and their adventures in another show. If we do that, we get Space Adventure Cobra and Dirty Pair. I don't think this is that much of an exaggeration. Daitarn 3 is pretty much those two shows stitched together, if only it didn't predate them. The Space Adventure Cobra manga was concurrent with Daitarn 3, but it wouldn't be animated until 1982, and the earliest Dirty Pair novels are from 1980, and they wouldn't be animated until 1985 by Sunrise. Both of those are aimed at an older and slightly more a mature audience, and both are better for it. Don't get me wrong, Daitarn 3 is fantastic and I absolutely do recommend it. But it ain't as good as Dirty Pair and it ain't as good as Cobra. It really feels like it could have been. The better episodes very nearly are, but it just needed to be less of a kids show. Like, the lead characters are the rich, good-looking male hero and his 2 hot girlfriends, and Toppo. Toppo is one of the better child boy sidekicks I've seen in shows like this, but he don't need to be there. The show does not require Toppo. Hey, you want to get real for a moment? What I would have liked is if Tsuchida, Reika's partner from Interpol who got shot in the first episode, had stuck around instead of the kid. The show's 3 most central characters are plainly in a polycule, and that rules, but also there isn't any tension. There's a sense where the show is able to sort of get away with it, so to speak, because it's presented in the manner of a frictionless cis-hetero juvenile fantasy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not asking for or expecting a liberatory depiction from a 40-year-old kid's cartoon for boys, but this fantasy could be more exciting, which is an unfortunate problem for a fantasy to have. Banjo's childhood friend he has a clear homosexual attraction towards exists for all of 1 episode. The handful of gay Meganoids don't last either. Beauty and Reika's relationship outside of Banjo might be excused as just roommates by a sufficiently unmotivated viewer. The show could do more to argue for itself. Am I crazy for thinking that introducing a second hot guy would help with that? I think it could, especially if it's clear that all 3 of the main characters were cool with that. Like, everyone here is already bi, it's just that Banjo's bisexuality is only apparent in particular isolated episodes. Tsuchida or some other guy just being around, who isn't Toppo or Garrison, no disrespect to Garrison, could address that. Or maybe that's just my inner Fujoshi speaking. Look up that word on your own, that ain't this video. Listen, every other show I've talked about on this channel has been positively chaste, with maybe the exception of Yusha Raiden. Daitarn 3 being as erotic as it is already one of the big things that distinguishes it, so it's a shame the show doesn't lean more in on that. Daitarn 3 being horny and the manner it employs that horniness should be a bigger part of the cartoon. The joyful polycule against the mind-controlled and loving-it cyborgs. And it still kind of is that sometimes. At least when it's not about some losers stranded on the moon who want to cut the Earth in half, or about a model collector who bought himself a shrink ray instead of a 3D printer, or to bring things back around, when it's not a science fiction story about legacy of slavery spiraling inwards towards disaster. A story where the famous Haran Banjo, who may be rich and fun and libertine, also hides deep personal trauma. Where he has a nervous breakdown that ends his relationships. Where he won't even leave his room to say goodbye. Where Reika blithely notes how they all live in different worlds, and where Beauty wishes she were more upset about how everyone's going their own ways. And maybe that hits as hard as it does because you do see them be happy together for so many episodes, because the joy was real. Daitarn 3 has 40 episodes, and 39 of those aren't the last one, but one of them is. Daitarn 3 ends on an exclamation mark. The ending, the "I'm sick of this" line sticks with you. It settles indigestible in your gut. You ruminate on something like that. Giant robot Yuri space opera poet Thaliarchus put it well when he described it as aggressively off-key. The Meganoids are interesting villains and an interesting science fiction device. And while they are evil, it is the opinion of this channel that non-consensual mind control surgery is bad, they also represent a possibility space that their destruction forecloses. Or maybe it doesn't. More than once, the show entertains the idea that something like the Meganoids is an inevitable development. Pre-Meganoid cyborgs existed and already had a tendency of turning against their human masters. The human-built battleship Magellan was designed from entirely different principles and technology, and it went rogue in the same fashion. Maybe this is something humankind will still have to reckon with. Banjo's victory might not only be incomplete, but impossible. Maybe you can't fight this change with giant robots. But whatever conflicts involve this approaching new type of human will have to happen in some other cartoon. This one's over. I thought this was going to be a short video. Daitarn 3 barely has a plot, I thought. How much could I actually have to say about it? Well, the script is over 20,000 words at this point, and that means the video will push 2 hours unless I really edit things down. Fuck me, I guess. Now, this is a good problem to have, and it made working on this video a blast, but it wasn't the easy, relaxing video I was thinking it'd be. Is Daitarn 3 a good show? Yeah, I'm confident I could show almost any episode of this show to one of my friends, even the ones not into robots or anime, and they would enjoy it. Do I like Daitarn 3? I do quite a bit. But all the same, it's not really my favorite, you know? One of the things I like 70s robot shows is that a lot of the time they'll have an unexpected bite to them. Like, I am a little bit here for that bridge to Terabithia shit. I like it when a show has some baffling attempted pathos or some sheer outrageousness. I like it when these shows are mean. And Daitarn 3 mostly isn't. But despite its comedy and light tone, and for all that it's primarily an exhibition of style and craft, it isn't a dumb show. It has a surprising bit of narrative texture. Things in it are often just a bit more complicated than they first appear. One final quote, this time from scriptwriter Kenichi Matsuzaki. That's the Tomino smell. At first glance, it looks like a typical giant robot show or gag show, but he gives it a grown-up aroma. He doesn't simplify it just because it's aimed at children. He always includes things that give the kids a suitable challenge. Mr. Tomino never makes fun of children. Like the other shows directed by Yoshiyuki Tomino that I've covered, those were Yusha Raiden and Zambot 3, this cartoon hasn't had an official English release. You can't catch it on Amazon Prime or Crunchyroll or Tubi or Gelgoog or anyplace else. Well, some of my audience might be able to. The show was a big hit overseas, as I mentioned. Depending on where you live, it may very well still be on some channel. But we Americans are out of luck. The English fan translation that's available seems to be partly translated from the original Japanese and partly translated from the Italian dub. As such, it has some inconsistencies. The Mechamaru, for example, are sometimes translated as Mechamals and I think at one point Mechanimals. Don Zother might be more correctly named Don Saucer and Zen a Flying Saucer. I think Zother is an official translation, however, so the translators might have felt obligated to stick with it. These minor things aside, the translation is excellent. Of course, I will be supporting the official release, if it ever happens. When I first started this channel, information on older anime was scarce, at least in English. I tried to keep the focus heavily on my personal perspective, because that's what I had access to. But information has become increasingly available, and I have had the tremendous good fortune to have interviews and retrospectives by people who worked on the show made available to me. I am very grateful to my fellow fans and to the genuine scholars who have made this work accessible. In particular, I feel quite a bit in debt to Mark Simmons and Craker2K. I'd also like to shout out the Anime-Tudes blog, which I didn't consult much for Daitarn 3, but which proved very helpful in some previous videos. It rocks that more information is out there. Additionally, shoutouts to Thaliarchus, author of Cosmic Warlord Kinbright, the aforementioned giant robot Yuri space opera poetry. And if you like that, you should also check out the Gordian cycle of cyborg space biker Yuri, written in imitation of the Ulster cycle of medieval Irish legend by Kadia RX. And a special thanks to the good people of the Skull Eater Center for their help in identifying Yu-Gi-Oh cards and for cueing me into some research. Thank you to all of my viewers. I've made a handful of the Super Robot Blueprint videos now, and what I've learned is that it's just a lot of fun to be able to info dump about something I like to a captive audience. Now you might say you're not a captive audience, that you could have stopped watching at any point. You didn't though. In all seriousness, I do appreciate it. Finally, to answer the question on everyone's mind, the blonde or the brunette? Well,